Is organic food worth it? And should you opt for organic food every time you go to the supermarket? That is going to be the topic of today's conversation. I'm also going to go through the basics of what a pesticide is, why we should be aiming to reduce our exposure to them, and practical shopping tips, including the types of ingredients that I tend to opt for organic when I'm shopping for my weekly meals. Before we get started, I want to give you the 5 takeaways right at the top of this podcast. Number 1, don't sweat it. The first thing that you want to be thinking about is diversity of your ingredients, because more plants rather than conventional versus organic has a lot more evidence for it. So rather than focusing on the detrimental impact of eating non-organic, I want you to always think about more plants, more diversity, and the basics of healthy eating before we get into the weeds of actually organic versus conventional, even though it is a very important topic. Number 2, reducing pesticides is, underline, important for human and environmental health. I don't want to discount that at all. Third, if you can make small swaps to organic foods, prioritize those foods that you tend to consume more of. And generally, this includes things like citrus fruits, grapes, berries, and some types of greens as well. To reduce the cost, I would start with the staples as well, so grains and other carbohydrates that we'll talk about. And I think the last thing is, this can't be something that we have to put on ourselves solely. We've got to be supporting wider organizations that are pushing for more policy changes that allow what's in our food to become a lot more healthful for us, a lot more transparent, and a lot better for environmental health as well. And stick around to the end of the podcast, because I'm going to talk to you about why everything I say for the next few minutes or so, probably more than a few minutes, could be complete BS. So I want to call myself out, because we're working with dirty data and limitations of which I will be very, very transparent about right at the bottom of this podcast. And before you listen to anyone else talking about why you should never eat conventional food or you should always go for organic, just remember the limitations that I'm going to do right at the bottom of this podcast. So let's start with the basics. Pesticides. What is a pesticide? So a pesticide is a chemical substance or biological agent that's used to control or repel or kill or manage pests. And pests, most people think about rats or rodents when they think about pests, but it can also include things like weeds, fungi, bacteria, viruses, aphids, other organisms that can be harmful to the growth of a crop that you're trying to optimize. The perfect pesticide would be an agent that is inert to non-targets, i.e. us, so things like obviously humans, but microbes, other organisms in the environment, and solely target the pest that we're trying to get rid of or to manage. And also a pesticide that would be perfect is something that's not going to have any long-term environmental consequences. Obviously, that's far from a reality, and that would be an absolute unicorn. Pesticides do get a bad rap. I think even the word pesticide or herbicide just seems to conjure up a dirty sort of world. But before we get into the weeds of why pesticides are harmful and why we need to reduce them, they are really, really important. And I think without petrochemicals, we would have famines, we have crop diseases that affect human health at scale. The Green Revolution was incredible, but there does need to be a balance between everything. I'll give you an example for which there isn't a pesticide, but in tomatoes there is there are a number of different issues, including viroids. So a viroid is the smallest known pathogen of plants, and it consists of a single strand of RNA. If you think about your DNA, it's a double helix. RNA is just a single strand of your genes, and 4 viroids have been isolated in the UK that pose a significant threat to tomato production. I'll give you an example. So potato spindle tuber viroid, also known as PST small vd, it's probably the most well-known of all the different viroids in the farming community. It's got worldwide distribution. It's been found in Outbreaks have been found in the UK, Germany, Netherlands, that are responsible for huge amounts of production of food globally in greenhouses. And at the moment, there isn't a way in which to rid a greenhouse of an infection with this particular virus. It involves hygiene, hand washing, completely disinfecting every area, having to move to a new facility. Like, it's almost like the COVID of tomatoes that exists in many different forms, for which there is no vaccine, no treatment whatsoever. And you could argue that this is the result of overuse of pesticides, monocultures, inorganic farming practices that has led to this susceptibility. But I just wanted to give you a flavor of what could potentially happen without the use of any sort of control measure or any sort of pesticide, because I think there is this incorrect idea that you don't need pesticides at all, and it's just all a big money-making scheme. I think there is certainly a huge amount of use for different sorts of pesticides in controlling issues like this that could wipe out massive swathes of crops for human at the detriment of human health as well. So before we go into pesticides, I just want you to understand that pesticides do have a use. It's the overuse of them and the lack of other ways of farming and the over-reliance on them that I think has got us to a situation where we're finding pesticide residues in almost all our foods. Okay, now you know what pesticides are, the different types of pesticides that we have out there. What is organic? Organic is a type of farming that actively lowers the use of pesticides, and it does this via crop rotation, plowing, other management techniques, including the use of things like aphid-eating insects. That's where you release certain types of insects into by surrounding hedges, and that actually controls the pest that you're trying to manage. There's even this concept of introducing parasitic pests, parasitic wasps, where they actually lay their eggs in the aphids, and then a few days later they emerge and they eat the aphid. I mean, it sounds like alien, but it is pretty crazy what people can do with organic farming practices. There is this idea that organic has no use of pesticides whatsoever. That's incorrect. It's a way of lowering the use of pesticides, and there are some approved pesticides that organic farms can use. Most organic farmers use integrated pest management to control pests and diseases. So that's a system that works with nature rather than the over-reliance on agropetrochemicals, and it means that they're using less pesticides less regularly, and they don't have to rely on them as well. I mentioned that there are some approved pesticides that are used in organic farming. There's around 15 in the UK that are approved, as opposed to over 450. I think it's close to 500 conventional farming approved pesticides in the EU database as well. There are going to be some issues as we move, but this is for the UK listeners and viewers. There are going to be some issues when we move away from the EU, because we're not going to be protected by similar laws. That's a whole wider discussion. Some of the pesticides that are approved for use include pyrethroids, pheromones, deltamethrin, but these are only allowed to be used in insect traps. So you can't have spraying of entire crops with these chemicals. It has to be used in specific measured ways, and there also has to be an application to the organic board, or I think it's called the OTB, before they can even use these kind of chemicals. So there is a lot more restriction on the use of any pesticides. There are some other more natural sounding pesticides, things like spearmint oil, citronella. I remember using citronella spray actually as a mosquito repellent. Doesn't work as well as DEET, but obviously has less consequences. Quartz sand. And a few other minerals that are safe for human consumption and therefore are generally regarded as safe. Those are approved also within organic farming practices. So now you know what a pesticide is. You also know what organic practices is. How organic is organic? I think there's been a large amount of myth spreading around, well, organic's not really worth it because it's still contaminated. That is true. There are pesticides in soil, as well as pesticides that were banned decades ago that we still find in our food. And that's the main reason why they were banned, because they're so persistent in our environment. And there is cross-contamination from non-organic farms to organic farming in agriculture, as well as persistence in the environment. But that doesn't mean that organic is completely worthless, because the residues, as evidenced by some data that I'll refer to a little bit later in the podcast, is that it's much, much lower in terms of the number of residues that you find in organic foods. The other thing is there is no transparent information about these pesticide residues that you find on organic products in supermarkets, which I think is something that needs to change, although it wouldn't be a very good marketing technique, because I think if people saw the conventional products had pesticide residues, the organic products have pesticide residues, you might think, well, there's no point, I'm just going to go for the conventional cheaper option. But actually, as we'll get into a little bit later, it's much, much reduced. So I definitely think it is worth it. A study of soil in 11 European countries found UK sites had the second highest diversity of pesticide residues. So regardless of the organic label, you are going to get pesticide residues in. And that's just a fact of our environment that's polluted with these chemicals, unfortunately. But it is, I just want to underline, whilst organic isn't 100% free, it is vastly, vastly reduced. Now we know about organic, we know about the issues around organic products and not being 100% clean, and we know what pesticides are. What is the evidence that pesticides are harmful? And I think this comes down to the devil being in the dose, really. Before we get into what is quite a scary subject, I want you to remember and remind yourselves that you are an absolute detoxifying machine. You have liver, kidneys, you have sweat glands, you have your digestive tract. And I always use this quite glib example of how detoxifying we are by using the example of a smoker that's been a lifelong smoker, let's say 40, 50 years. They've been ingesting a known carcinogen, type 1 carcinogen, 20 times a day, and it might take decades before they get a diagnosis of lung cancer, skin cancer, cardiovascular disease, vascular disease. It may never even happen. It might happen earlier than that, but it just paints a very, very clear picture of just how incredible we are at removing these carcinogens, removing these pollutants from our body. That isn't to say that you can have as many chemicals as possible. We definitely need to reduce our body burden. I'll talk about what body burden is in a second. But just remind yourself just how incredible we are at detoxifying ourselves from known carcinogens, known pollutants in our environment. We are amazing. That being said, the evidence that pesticides are harmful, everything is a bit unclear. It can be difficult to gauge the full burden of pesticide residue impact on human health because toxicological data is missing for a lot of these active compounds, in that there aren't, given the number of different compounds there are today and how many there have been in the past, the evidence and the studies looking at them individually is lacking. The metabolites of these pesticides, again, is lacking, and in terms of looking at what the metabolites of these pesticides could potentially do to us in terms of harm. Pesticide cocktails, or the mixtures of these different pesticides, haven't been properly assessed. This makes it quite difficult to reliably predict their protracted health impacts over time. as it is for consumer products as well, which is why, I'm in agreement with this move to more clean consumer products for the same reasons, because we don't have the evidence around the potential negative impacts of these. Okay. Studies also have methodologic problems as well. So exposure misclassification, inadequate exposure assessments, these cause mixed results. There's recall bias in retrospective case control studies. So this is all to say that the long-term impacts of pesticides is unclear, but the general trend is toward negative health outcomes, and there are several positive associations that we see with long-term pesticide exposure as well as acute pesticide exposure. So I won't go into too much detail around the acute pesticide exposures from, say, workers who are literally spraying or involved in agriculture who have acute exposure, because I don't think that paints a clear picture for consumers of products with pesticide residues when it's far removed from the actual farms where these have been produced. But the long-time pesticide exposure appears to demonstrate links with neurologic and metabolic health consequences, autoimmune conditions, gut biome disturbances, infertility, and yes, an increase in certain cancers as well. You've heard me talk to Professor Shanna Swan on the podcast about the fertility effects of plastics, and we also talked about pesticides there as well. So, there's a whole combination effect here. This is why I started with the point about how detoxifying we are as in our human bodies. But there is a cocktail of all these different chemicals that we're being exposed to on a daily basis. One thing I thought would be useful is to look at some of the biggest consumers in the world of pesticides. And I came across a study that was published in Frontiers in Public Health in 2022. And they looked at one of the biggest consumers of pesticides in the world, which is Brazil. And Brazil, 80% of Brazil has a particular problem. And I just want to go through a couple of the points. 80% of pesticides that are authorized for use in their country are not allowed in at least 3 countries of the OECD European community. So they've got a much higher tolerance for the health effects of pesticides. The government does anyway. It's estimated, and I'm not too sure how they did this estimation because the actual original papers are in Spanish, so you're going to have to forgive me. But they estimated that each Brazilian consumes an average of 7 liters of pesticides per year. There are many acute and chronic poisonings per annum, 70,000. Brazil has a huge population, but 70,000 is still a huge number. They export, and this is very pertinent to UK listeners as well, they export most of their products to China and US. So whilst they might have lax regulations that are more lax than other countries, they still export a lot of their products to other countries that might have tighter regulations, although the US does not. The biggest global consumers of pesticides, as you would imagine, US, China, Brazil, Argentina, Ukraine, Canada. UK is number 25. So we're still big global consumers of pesticides in the grand scheme of things, but nowhere near as much as China, US, and Brazil. They're the top 3. A lot of these studies in this systemic review from Brazil were in Spanish, so I can't corroborate and thoroughly scrutinize, but there are a number of epidemiological studies that demonstrate associations between biomarkers of endocrine alterations. So this can be thyroid conditions, it could be metabolic health issues, and contamination with organochlorine pesticides in polluted areas. They obviously have a huge correlation with mortality rates from congenital malformations in the under 1 year group. So this is a group along with pregnant women who are uniquely susceptible to pesticides because of the growth of and neural development during that time of development. So That's particularly worrying, and I think that might be something to bookmark for any people listening to this who are thinking about getting pregnant, or who are pregnant, or have young children, to opt for organic products. That might be a pertinent, or opt for more organic products. That might be a pertinent decision to make, considering these associations. I do want to heighten that these are associations, and causation hasn't been fully elucidated, but I'm on the side of the precautionary principle. And overall, all articles on this topic have found that increased exposure to pesticides is related to central nervous system damage as well. They also discussed the occurrence of cancer as a result of exposure to pesticides. They did obtain a significant sample of over 12 million Brazilians from different areas of the country as well, and declared that consistent association with greater exposure to pesticides and more cancers, although it's very loose, and again, it's observational. So let's talk about what the limitations of this might be. You could argue that using Brazilian data and trying to compare this to us is not comparing apples to apples. Completely different nation, much bigger consumers of pesticides. And I agree, they have vastly different exposures and much more pesticides in their supply chain. But we still import plenty of food from other countries, including the US and China and India. I think with Brexit, that's only going to get more as we need to harness and nurture trade ties with other countries to secure supply. And we know what's going on with the war right now in Eastern Europe. Our food supply is still contaminated with DDT, and that was banned decades ago. We still find DDT contaminated samples, and this has been shown in the report that I'll go into in a little bit more detail a little bit later by the PRIF. So the PRIF are a government organization. It stands for Pesticide Residues in Food, and they're a committee that look at pesticide residues on an annual or quarterly basis, and they produce these annual reports, and they have clearly discussed as recently as 2 years ago in the latest annual report that DDT, which is banned, it's an organochloride, and it was banned because it is persistent in the environment. It lasts over 100 years. It concentrates in the fatty tissues of mammals like birds and fish. It can remain for decades. We're still dealing with DDT in our country. So the exposure to countries, even though they're far removed from us, it's still going to be affecting us as well. This is a global issue. It's not just something that we can wall ourselves off from here in the UK. Glyphosate is something that is probably the most contentious pesticide in the world. It's one of the most common active ingredients that are used. It's a herbicide. It's marketed as Roundup by Monsanto. It's been phased out in France, but actually in the UK it's increased, and the use of its increases by around 400% in the last 20 years. So yes, Brazil has its own issues. We also have our own issues as well. And that's why I think it's still pertinent for us to look at these far removed countries, even though they're much bigger consumers, because in the absence of rock solid evidence, I think we need to weigh up the potential harms and the potential benefits of exposure to these products. And so using the precautionary principle alone, I think moving to a more organic farming system is a pretty reasonable approach. So this isn't to scaremonger. I think this warrants a pragmatic, full-on discussion. I'd love to speak to someone from PRIF as well about this in a bit more detail, as they're closer to the data on this. But I think organic farming systems as the point of as the goal is a reasonable approach, and we still don't have a clear idea of the compounding effect, also referred to as the cocktail effect of these different pesticides. So I'd feel safer to assume And I'd be happy to be incorrect in the future, but I'd feel safer to assume that these are not healthy and we should be reducing our exposure to them. And that leads me to the next question. So we've talked about pesticides, we've talked about organic, we've talked about some of the evidence that it is not safe. What is the evidence, on the other hand, that eating organic is helpful or even healthful? So looking at a meta-analysis that was published in the British Journal of Nutrition, they reviewed 343 peer-reviewed publications and found that the concentrations of something that we talk about a lot on the podcast, polyphenols, which are micronutrients that you find concentrated in fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds. We know that gives their healthful properties because they're anti-inflammatory, they have antioxidant benefits, they can activate your immune system, they're healthful for your microbes. There's a whole plethora of benefits that we always talk about on the podcast here. But they found that the concentrations of these different micronutrients were substantially higher in organic crops versus conventionally based crops. And the reason why is because your polyphenols, these phytochemicals the umbrella term is phytochemical, also known as phytonutrients. These phytochemicals are the crop defense system. So when a crop is growing in the wild, to protect itself from insects, from the pests that we currently spray them with at the moment, they develop the production of these different chemicals to veer them off, to essentially poison them and kill them before they eat their entire body, let's say. So the more they have to endure hard weather, insects, all the different issues that you'd find in the wild, they have to develop more of these different phytonutrients. These phytonutrients, although they are natural insecticides, are actually healthful for us in the right quantities, which is why, if you overeat something like kale or spinach, you're probably going to get too many of these different products, and you don't want to be over-consuming, even though it's very, very hard to. But in the right doses, it is a mild stressor to our own body that actually leads to a beneficial outcome. The analogy I always use for this is like exercise. If you exercise your muscles and you did a snapshot of your muscles in that short period of time, you'll see all the muscle fibers that are sheared, torn, there's inflammation everywhere. You think this is a very unhealthful activity, but over time, the repairing effect of those leads to hypertrophy, better resilience of those muscle fibers, a stronger muscle fiber. That net benefit is that is a net benefit over the long term. Sort of the same thing with polyphenols. When you're consuming them, there's a mild stressor, actually leads to something called the ARE. So it's the antioxidant. I think it's the antioxidant regeneration effect. So it basically it improves your tolerance of these chemicals and leads to a net beneficial outcome. It activates your natural antioxidant system. That's essentially what it does. So with this in mind, if you are putting crops in an unnatural environment, you're giving them hydroponics where they have all the nutrients that they need, you're giving them the right temperatures, you're spraying them with pesticides so they don't need to develop these different chemicals, you can understand why they don't need to produce as many and why in conventional products they're much lower than in organic products. So there's the sort of simple reasoning as to why we find that using the statistics, they found a 20 to 40% increase in phytochemicals in organic foods rather than versus conventional foods. On balance, now I've said all these things, and I would love to believe that because of the increase in polyphenols, this leads to a better health effect of organic products. But I don't think that there is today convincing evidence that you will be healthier on an organic diet. I think the idea that because polyphenols are 30 to 40% higher in organic produce, they're therefore healthier for you. Doesn't have much evidence for. I'd love to believe it does, and it stands to reason, but there's nothing to stand for it other than the loose association and observational studies, which have plenty of confounders like their healthy user bias, for example. So there are some studies that show, okay, those who have organic products in their diet or more organic products have a lower risk of cancer, but it's very hard to disentangle the person who opts for organic products is most likely going to be quite a health conscious consumer who will exercise, who go to sleep on time, who might have a country home and they go there every weekend. They have much lower stress levels. They generally are more affluent. I don't know someone who is struggling to meet the bills every week opting for organic products. I think that's very unlikely. So there's so many different confounders, and even though there are quite big effects that we see in these observational studies, it's very, very hard to prove out, even though I'd like to believe that. The organic movement does have benefits outside of the potential increase in polyphenols that I think are still worth it as well. So even though what I've said it's probably not convincing for you to buy organic today, I still think there are reasons to buy organic. One of them is we get to vote with how we pay for things in the supermarket, for what we want to see in the future for our children, for the planet. And organic farms are essentially havens for wildlife because of the way they use crop rotation systems and natural insects, aphid-eating insects. They essentially grow hedges around them. That's a haven not just for the insects that will help the organic farm, but other insects as well, and the general environment for other bees and ants and all these other critters that provide a lot of nutrition for the soil as well. They're also protective against birds and butterflies and bees, of which many pesticides are detrimental to. And actually, there is some evidence to show that plant, insects, and bird life is 50% more abundant on organic farms. And it stands to reason because of the harshness of pesticides on these communities of organisms as well. I think the third thing, so, if you're convinced by the polyphenol argument and you want to consume organic for that reason, that's totally fine. All I'm saying is that there is not too much evidence for. Number two, the environmental impact. If you're an environmentalist, I think we're all moving in that direction and you want to see that, great. Organic's definitely the way forward. I think the third most convincing argument is body burden. And your body burden is likely to be lower. What is body burden? So for context, your body burden or the body burden of chemicals refers to the cumulative impact of various synthetic chemicals that include heavy metals, toxic substances that can be found in the human body, and it can be concentrated in bloodstream, fat, most likely, at any time that's acquired from your environment. So that could be pollutants from cars, the microparticles that we find from combustion. It could be from personal care products. It could be from water. It could be from, and obviously from food as well. So if you're reducing the pesticide residues, and I hasten to use the word reduce, if you're reducing your load of pesticides by going organic, your body burden is likely to be lower, and therefore the risks to health are potentially lower as well. So I think the organic sort of argument really goes down to how risk tolerant we are to pesticides, and I'm precautionary principle. I just want to underline the fact that is probably the best argument, I would say, for going organic. If we are individualists here and we just really care about ourselves and not really in the environment and everything else, reducing your body burden, that's likely to be lower, and there are some studies that show that as well. So by now, you should have a general understanding of everything. Pesticides, organic, how organic is organic, what the potential benefits of organic are, what the evidence for pesticides harms are. Let's talk about practical tips. I think, this is all super scary. Remind yourself that you're a detoxifying machine. What is the number one practical tip for me to say? I would say diversity on your plate is the number one priority, because that improves your digestive system, it reduces inflammation, it has all the health benefits. And we know that in the studies that we look at in terms of collection of ingredients, largely plant-based diet, lots of variety, those are where we see the associations with health benefits. It does not discriminate between organic and inorganic at the moment, but I would say that's probably the most convincing arguments I have for nutrition. So always think about your nutrition, what you're putting on your plate first, rather than the criteria of those individual whole unprocessed foods. A whole unprocessed, diverse, colorful diet is your number one goal. Number two, let's get into the details of, okay, I've done that, tick, 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 I exercise, I sleep really well, I try and reduce my stress, I get a diverse diet. These are all things I want to take my health to the next level. I want to be a lot more pragmatic. Going back to the expert committee on pesticide residues in food, PRIF, they are appointed by DEFRA in the UK, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. There is a similar organization in the States that is approved, I believe, by the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. And these guys over here in the UK, PRIF, are entirely made up of independent members with a wide range of expertise. I've looked at their contributors list, and there are a number of scientists, people with masters in public health, people with a politics background, like all farmers, like all sort of like huge range of expertise. And they advise on pesticide residues in a food monitoring program, because quarterly they do a basket of goods, and they use the most up-to-date lab testing means that they're completely transparent about. And you can find their reports. I've linked them in the show notes, as all the data and the stats that I'm using in today's episode on the doctorskitchen.com website. You can go check it out there. You can download them yourself from the gov.uk website. And their quarterly reports are really comprehensive. So, for example, just to give you an example of the 11th report, which was done in 2021, there's a little bit of a lag between them, and that will come down to my limitations at the bottom of this podcast episode. In 2021, they reviewed 3,500 samples of food and drink available in the UK supply chain, and they were tested for pesticide residues, and they did almost 400 different pesticides that they tested for as well. So what everyone's probably wondering is, okay, what are the top fruit and veg to buy organic in the UK? So their latest list, and this is done by the number of ingredients that had multiple residues in the UK. Number one, topping the list, was grapefruit. Grapes was number two. Banana, berries and small fruits. They didn't specify exactly which small fruits, but they said berries and small fruits. Peppers, raspberries, spring greens and kale. So you're seeing a bit of a pattern here. It's citrus, and there's exotic fruits, bananas, berries that tend to be sprayed, and strawberries are a big contender for that as well. Peppers, can't really explain, and then spring greens and kale. So there is a bit of a pattern there. But the way this list has been compiled looks specifically at multiple residues. So they look at every single ingredient. They look at the amount of pesticides, the number of pesticides found, the number of multiple residues found in that. So if they had more than one different pesticide that they found evidence of. And then they also look at the number of times they tested, and they found that the pesticide residue was above the minimum required level. So there's a minimum upper limit that is permitted for pesticide residues on these products. This is purely looking at the top offenders for those who had multiple residues on an individual ingredient. If you look at another way, is looking at the ingredients that perhaps have less occurrence of multiple residues, but more instances where the residues are beyond that minimum required limit. And if you look at the case of 2021, which is the latest data that we have for, it's a very different picture. And I'll go through those. Number 1, beans with pods. Number 2, okra. Number 3, herbs. It just says herbs. It doesn't specify which herbs, whether it's dill, parsley, coriander, doesn't say. And remember, this is the minimum required limit, number of times that this exceeded the minimum required limit. So it might just have one pesticide, but it might be a quite high amount. Number 4, pumpkin and squash. Number 5, peas with pods. 6, kiwi. 7, dried beans. 8, rice. We'll go into rice in a bit. So very different way of looking at the same data set. You can classify them as those who had multiple residues on. So you could argue that there's a cocktail effect going on there. I'm more worried about that. Or you could look at, okay, well, there's no cocktail effect going on, but the pesticide residues are super high in these individual ingredients. So you might want to opt for ones that, and there is a bit of a pattern there as well, I would say. Okra, pumpkin, beans with pods, dried beans, kiwi tend to be grown outside of the UK. So you might find that the restrictions on pesticide use might be a little bit more lax in the countries that are growing these, or the greenhouses, or wherever they might be. So that's just something to be aware of. We'll go into a little bit more detail in grains in a second. In the US, this list is compiled by the EWG, the Environmental Working Group. In the UK, you can find this from a group called PAN UK. And they basically go through the data that you find on PRIF. This is PRIF and PAN, two separate organizations, and they essentially create lists based on the data that is quite hard to read in the government website. They make it a lot more accessible. They, I think, are donation funded. I'm not too sure if they're a charity or whether they're registered. I'd love to speak to them as well, actually. They compile the list for you, and they also campaign for lower pesticide residues and lower pesticide use in general in farming in Europe, globally, but also they've got a UK division as well. So the list for American users, you can find this on the EWG website. They use the information from the USDA and the FDA, and the most recent top 5 contaminated foods: strawberries, number 1, 2, spinach, number 3, kale, collard, mustard greens, number 4, peaches, number 5, pears. So again, you can see there's a bit of a pattern there. It's mainly fruit and veg. But yeah, it's definitely problematic. And if you look through those lists, and you can find the full list on the PAN website or the EWG website, you can say, well, I tend to eat a lot of peaches, or I tend to eat a lot of berries. I'm going to opt for organic. And I'm going to give you some practical tips in a minute about how you can choose organic and what things to look out for as well. Grains. Now, I haven't mentioned grains apart from in the bottom of one of those lists. Oats is a bit of an issue. And I tend to have oats a couple of times a week, I would say. Love my oats. I go for organic many times for this reason. I also mix up my oats as well. So I don't just have a big bowl of oats on their own, because I think it can spike your glucose quite considerably. I always have it with cacao powder. I have it with nuts, seeds, maybe a peanut butter, maybe a protein powder. You can get like a hemp seed based protein powder. I just tend to use hemp seeds sometimes, to mix it up, to add a little bit more fiber, a bit of diversity. It doesn't spike my glucose level near as much as just a bowl of oats in their own. But oats are a bit of an issue. In 2019, 94% of oats, 94% contain residues of more than one pesticide. That was from the PRIF data set. And the reason why is because it's sprayed before harvest to artificially dry these crops. It makes harvesting easier. That's the main reason, and reduces competition from other pests, like weeds and grasses and that kind of stuff. So glyphosate and chlormequat residues were found in all grain produce tested in both 2018 and 2019. And it's a big issue with oats as well. And like I said earlier, glyphosate in the UK, I always used to think that glyphosate wasn't an issue as much in the UK. It's more of a US problem. It has risen, the use of glyphosate has risen by 16% between 2016 to 2020. And the proportion of bread containing 2 or more pesticides has doubled in the past year to 50% as well. So in terms of grains, it's not looking great. Oats, rice, I'll get to a study about rice in a second, and bread are things that I would seriously consider going organic for, considering the number of pesticides used in it and probably the amount that we consume as well, in this country and beyond as well. Going into rice, there was a 2017 study in France that found that children who consume greater amounts of pasta, rice, semolina, breakfast cereals, whole grain bread had high levels of these metabolites of a particularly nasty pesticide in their urine compared to those who consume less of those foods. So that isn't to say that you should never eat grain at all, but maybe if it's more of a staple in your household, it might be something that you want to mitigate, because there are clear issues with that. So if you eat a lot of one particular staple, let's say you're a prolific granola eater or whatever you might be, you might want to consider going organic for that ingredient or diversifying as well. So maybe instead of having all of that every single Monday to Friday, you want to diversify and have less of that and go for something a little bit more colorful or diverse, or something that doesn't rely on you having the granola every single day. It's a lot to get your head around, but I'll go into some more even more practical solutions in a bit. I haven't talked about animal products. I always go organic with animal products, probably more so for the ethical reasons. The concentrates of these pesticides can be found in the fat. They probably, in terms of conventional produce, they probably use imported grains and conventionally created grains with tons of pesticides in their feed. So it stands to reason that, if we're eating pesticide residues in our food and we can find it in our urine and our fat cells, it's definitely going to be found in the animals that we consume as well. And these grains are probably imported from countries with far worse practices. Although, saying that, most of the residues found by PRIF, the group in the UK, the residues were those that were found in the preparation of meats rather than the use in agriculture. So I could be wrong about that, but again, I just tend to err on the side of the precautionary principle. Interestingly, there is no minimum required limit for pesticide residues found in fish. And fish, and I'm saying this as a current pescatarian, I no longer eat chicken, beef, and other animal products. I tend to exclusively eat fish at the moment. Fish appears to have the most cocktail of different pesticide residues, probably because we're polluting the water so much, and that is literally their environment. And where you tend to find these fish are going to be, in areas where there's going to be a lot of shipping materials and dumping of rubbish and all the rest of it. So it's a horrible thing to think about, but yeah, it's fish. Fish have the most in terms of the cocktail of residues that find them, and strangely enough, no minimum required limit. So yeah, it's one of the, it's all looking pretty grim at the moment. So let me go through some solutions, and I just want to acknowledge the fact that I am very aware that we're going through a cost of living crisis. This is coming from a place of personal privilege where I can afford to opt for organic produce where possible to feed myself and my family. And this is an option that not everyone has access to. So for your information, this can be quite scary, but here are some practical tips. And I don't go 100% organic all the time. I'll be honest about that, because it's impossible when you're consuming food outside at a restaurant. There is no way in which you can tell whether, unless you're really going to be bugging the chef or the maitre d' or wherever you might be, about where they got their products from and whether they're organic or not. If they were organic, they'd probably be putting it on the menu. But it's going to be impossible for you to avoid pesticides at all costs, even if you eat organic 100% of the time. So just bear that in mind. I go organic where I can, and I tend to focus on the staples. So things like grains, oats, animal products, fish. Well, fish you can't really go organic, but that tends to be where I go organic and where you should be thinking about going organic yourself. Buy frozen. So frozen food, hopefully most people have come around to the idea, and I've talked about it in a previous budget podcast, about how the nutrient value of a lot of these different products are actually higher in frozen products because there's less handling, they're frozen at source, flash frozen at source, they're distributed, they're shelf stable, they can taste delicious. The texture is obviously not going to be as great if we're comparing like a frozen strawberry with a fresh strawberry, of course, but the way you can use that fresh strawberry in a granita, in a smoothie, in a dessert, you can make it your own. So buy frozen organic. It is a really, really good hack. It's far cheaper. It ensures that you're going to get a really good quality product. And if you're having lots of berries, for example, and you can't afford the organic fresh stuff because the conventional fresh stuff is pretty expensive anyway, go organic. And every now and then, if you want to splurge and you want to have some fresh strawberries, and the organic one is £8 and the conventional one is £3, just go for what you can afford and enjoy it. But just be aware that if you're going to be consuming it on a weekly basis, you might want to go organic if you're a big consumer of those. So frozen organic, really good tip. Number 2, canned organic. So canned and jarred foods like beans. You can even get like things like artichokes, carciofi in what they call it in Italy. You can get these like amazing puntarelli, which are these it's like from the Brassica family. They usually preserve them in olive oil. You can find those organic, and they're often very, very cheap as well. So the organic beans might be £1.10. The conventional beans might be 70 or 80p. You can get it cheaper than that as well if you look for the budget ranges. But generally, organic is around that price point. And I tend to go organic because, as we saw, beans with pods and dried beans tend to be quite polluted because we tend to get them from countries where they have much laxer pesticide practices. We talk about this every Sunday in our Seasonal Sundays newsletter that you can find in the link if you're watching this in YouTube or in the podcast. Every Sunday, we do a deep dive into an ingredient. We talk about the history of it, the cultural relevance of it, the crop practices, like how to use it, and recipes that you can find on the Doctor's Kitchen app. Again, which you can find in the link down below. Farmers markets. We always call out farmers markets that you can find in the UK. A great way of having a direct conversation with your grower, a direct conversation with a biodynamic farm or an organic farm, and asking them about like, why is it so much more expensive? What is their margin? How difficult it is to grow organic? And why there is that excess price point. You can begin to really, really put a value on food that I think the supermarkets have devalued because we're so used to having cheap produce. Nothing against supermarkets because they've done a fantastic job of driving down the price, but we have to look at the cost trade-off of that. And the trade-off appears to be body burden with the overuse of pesticides. So definitely speak to farmers markets. You may be able to find some bargains if you're looking for cheap seasonal ingredients. They tend to be cheaper when they're in season. So definitely go and have a conversation with them. Another tip, grow your own herbs. We found that herbs tend to have the higher amounts of pesticides beyond the minimum required level. Rather than a mixture of pesticides, they tend to have higher amount of the above the minimum required limit. So grow your own. You can grow your own. You can grab seeds. You can grab organic seeds. Grow them in any place. There's a whole bunch of like home growing videos that you can find. I'm no good at growing my own herbs, but I'm definitely going to get into it now that I know about green herbs. So try those. Lots of organic fruit and veg boxes. The way they make their margin is because they don't give you choice. So you sacrifice choice for organic produce that tends to be in season, which I think is actually a fair trade-off, because they need to ensure that they don't have any waste. They have a steady demand, and they can satisfy their produce supply with consumers. So I think that's a really good trade-off to have. Ensure you've got organic foods. I don't have any affiliation with any boxes like Riverford, Able and Cole in the UK. There's probably loads in the US as well that will deliver ingredients straight to your door. So I think that's a fantastic trade-off. So, and another call out as well, grains and pulses. So grains and pulses, you can definitely buy dried organic. And if you buy dried, yes, you have to process it yourself through boiling, steaming, all the rest of it. But you get a much cheaper product. And again, no affiliation with Hodmedods in the UK, but they do a whole range of different grains. They even do things like quinoa. They do things like corn. They've got oats, I believe, all organic. They've got a great story about their farm. I would support growers like that because they're doing a great job for not only the environment and the soil, but for the organic message at large. And let's not forget, if you can afford to go organic now and you choose to, this, like I was saying earlier, when you go to the supermarket and you purchase organic products, you are voting with your pounds. You can vote with your dollar by choosing the produce in the supermarket, and that will drive down the price of organic as it increases the supply. So that's what I'm going to say. So those are my very quick tips. Go organic where you can, focus on your staples, buy frozen, buy canned organic, check out farmers markets, number 4, grow your own herbs, number 5, check out fruit and veg organic boxes, number 6, number 7, a bonus, grains and pulses you can buy online, and support companies like Hodmedods that are doing a great job at improving the organic message as well. I always get asked about peeling, and otherwise known as household processing. Now, there was a really interesting article in Toxicology Reports from 2022, I believe, maybe earlier than that. And they were looking at this question: if I peel my vegetables, does it reduce the pesticide residues? What about if I blanch it? What about if I scrub it in vinegar or scrub it in water with a good brush? Really, really good questions. They tried to answer this, but obviously you can't go through all 3,500 ingredients that the PRIF guys do, and you can't look at every single of the 400 pesticides. So these guys looked at, which I think is a fair collection of ingredients. They looked at pears, apples, peaches, greens, tomatoes, and they looked at 7 different pesticides. And they tried a whole bunch of different things. So washing, peeling, heating, and even canning and jarring as well, which is a process that is quite sophisticated where you can it. So they showed that acetic acid, i.e. vinegar, has the potential to act as a strong chelating agent that makes the residues unavailable. So if you find that the residues are on the outside, this potentially shows that you can reduce the pesticide residue of your food by spraying with a vinegar solution. It doesn't talk about specifically, or I didn't see the concentration of the vinegar that they used or the type, but acetic acid you can definitely find online in these fruit and veg washes, but you can make your own as well. So if you are having to buy conventional and you're going to be using potatoes or whatever, just spray it with acetic acid. That may reduce the pesticide residue. So that's one tip. They also found that juicing, fermenting, and heating were found to be the most common and cost-effective methods for pesticide residue dissipation. And you find that with various fruits and vegetables. So if you're going to be blanching, let's say, your broccoli, and it has to be over 100 degrees centigrade, so what they looked at, the organic compounds of the pesticides tends to break down. So that may be a way to reduce the residues that you find in your product as well. Canning, which I mentioned, is quite a sophisticated, elaborate process. You boil it, you steam it, you sterilize. There were hardly any traces of residues that they analyzed in canned apricots and peaches, and that's where they sterilize it for 121 degrees centigrade for 15 minutes, which is generally how the canning process works. So there is some positive news around looking at reducing pesticide residues through doing both simple household processing measures like peeling and steaming, blanching, as well as what you would find in the food production process as well. Limitations, obviously, looking at only 7 ingredients, looking at only a handful of pesticide compounds. Who knows about the other compounds? But there is a bit of light at the end of the tunnel. Also, as I'll probably get a question about this, peeling for me kind of breaks my heart, because we know the phytochemicals tend to concentrate on the outside of your ingredient, because, like I explained earlier, when a crop the reason why these crops have these beneficial phytochemicals is as a protector from insects that are trying to attack them from the outside. So that's why they concentrate them in the peels, and that's where you get most of those polyphenols. So you tend not to want to peel them and throw them away. So that won't be something that I'll be doing, but it is something that you could do if you prefer eating vegetables without the peel on as well. If you don't like the taste of butternut squash with a peel on or whatever, you can remove it. That's totally fine. You're still getting a lot of the nutrients. The other uncomfortable fact is that, yes, pesticides you don't just spray the pesticide. You do it throughout the whole life cycle of the product in certain cases. So it's likely that the pesticide is going to be in the flesh of the ingredient as well. I don't believe they looked at that. So look, that's some light at the end of the tunnel, that you can potentially reduce your burden, even if you can't afford to switch to organic produce in certain cases or completely. This is one way in which you can reduce that. Okay, let's talk finally about why everything I've just said in this entire podcast could be complete BS, complete rubbish, and I have no idea what I'm talking about. I'm not a pesticide expert, just a doctor, nutrition masters, love to play with vegetables, love to create recipes. What do I know about pesticides? So the first thing is that the data changes from year to year and country to country. So the list that I talked about earlier with grapefruits at the top and berries down below, this changes from year to year, and there is quite a difference across the years. Generally, berries, grapes, small fruits, citrus, greens, those tend to be at the top of the list, but it does change from year to year. Sometimes mushrooms are up there, sometimes tomatoes, and it varies from country to country as well. So that's one thing. That's a huge limitation. The most recent data, bearing that in mind what I just said, the most recent data from the UK was published in 2022, reporting foods that were tested 2 years ago. So the speed and the cadence of this wonderful group that is appointed by DEFRA is still quite slow in terms of giving us real up-to-date information about pesticide residues. So there's loads of gaps, and there are loads of gaps in the actual data that they produce as well, because not every single fruit and vegetable is in their list that they test. So it's just a limitation of the fact that they're doing this pretty much solo. The other thing is grains. Oats were not tested in 2021, for example, so we don't actually have up-to-date data on that. Same thing for animal products. Not every single animal product was tested, and there is a consideration that we need to make actually about how widely available do we make at-home testing for pesticide residues on your food. So, is there a day where we can swipe our apple or swipe our grapefruit and figure out how many pesticides are on this, or wash it in a solution, put it into an at-home container? Is that going to generate more health anxiety? My hunch is probably yes, actually. I'm not too sure whether I would do that myself. But the flip to that is, okay, we might not have home testing. Should food producers be committed to showing or using food labeling what their pesticide residue stats are at point of sale. Would that drive more consumer behavior toward organic? Is that something that would be beneficial to the economy, or would that again drive a further health anxiety around this topic? Again, I'm on the fence about that. I would personally want to know, in the same way I love to know about my sleep scores and my sleep data. Is that for everyone? Probably not. I think for a lot of people, including colleagues of mine, having that level of information is probably a little bit too much. So yeah, something again to consider. And I think government action is probably the biggest thing that I want to see as a result of this. The reason why we pay our taxes, the reason why we have these organizing bodies is to fend for us, to keep us healthy and secure. So that's really what I want to see as a result of more people being aware of pesticide residues, a lot more activism. And there's ways in which you can get involved by supporting people like PAN UK. There's the Organic Trade Board. There's a whole bunch of links that I put in the show notes at thedoctorskitchen.com. And I think one other thing in terms of technology that I'd love to see is at-home personal testing kits to see what my current body burden is. The cocktail of pesticides, the cocktail of plastics that might be in me, and measuring myself 6 months down the line after I made changes to see, what benefit that's had, if any. Again, with the caveat that could cause some health anxiety as well. But personally, I'd love to know that. Look, there are loads of things that I've talked about today. There are loads of practices that I think you should focus on. A, you are a detoxifying machine. B, the best evidence that we have is to diversify your plate, have a plant-predominant diet, and eat as healthily as possible. Exercise. We know sweat is one of the main ways in which we rid ourselves of pollutants and things like heavy metals, cadmium, for example. Sauna might actually be one way in which to encourage that process, as well as exercise that has those cardiovascular benefits. By virtue of diversifying your food and having a high fiber diet, you're going to be removing environmental pollutants via the digestive tract, something that we've talked about before when we talked about PCOS and inflammatory bowel disease, removing the estrogen effect of these environmental pollutants, minimizing our plastic exposure, so not heating in plastic containers, trying to use glass where possible. That, again, is one way in which we can reduce our overall body burden, and trying to support and buy organic for our staples as much as possible. So I really hope you enjoyed this. It was meant to be a short episode, but I've gone on a little bit. There are so many more things that I could go on to. If you do have any questions, just holler at me at Twitter at doctors_kitchen. Sign up for the Doctor's Kitchen newsletter every single week. We do seasonal Sundays. We do Eat, Listen, Read, where I share recipes, and we talk about what you can eat to live a healthy lifestyle, to have a healthy way of living. All these things are going to compound to improve your resilience against things like pesticides and all the other conditions that we talk about every single week. I really hope you enjoy this episode, and I'll see you here next time. If you like that video, then you will love the full library from the Doctor's Kitchen podcast. We talk about inflammation, immune health benefits, and much, much more about food as medicine, including this video right here that you can click through right now.